10:05. Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM. KFYO. We go to the phones and we visit with with our guests that we have on each Friday from the Texas Tribune. It's Patrick Svitek. Patrick, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Chad. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. We'll take a quick look at the legislature this week. It was kind of an easy week for lawmakers. It was inauguration week and also some budgets that were released as well, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, one of the big substantive headlines this week was the release, as you mentioned, of the Texas House's proposed budget and the Texas Senate's proposed budget. And the kind of key difference that we saw here was that they ended up being about $3 billion apart on new public education spending. And this is obviously what, is front and center here in Austin, is this agreement that the state needs to increase or put new money into public schools. And we have been hearing that in speech after speech for weeks from state leaders. And so finally these budgets began to flesh out what exact numbers they would like to see when it comes to that. The Texas House proposed putting $7 billion in new state funds into public schools, while the Texas Senate proposed $4.3 billion in that same category. And so they're about $3 billion apart. This is just kind of a starting point for debate, and so now we go forward from here.
Yeah, and this is where it gets difficult. You know, it's easy to give the speeches and say that we're all together on this stuff. One of the differences I think that we're seeing between the Senate and the House, Patrick, is that they want to go about different ways, maybe, of increasing funding for education, right? Like the Senate, it seems to me the Senate is more prepared to give money to teachers as far as a teacher's raise, whereas maybe the House wants to go a little bit further than that. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so once you get below those two big kind of top-line numbers, there are definitely some differences. And we have seen more of an emphasis from the lieutenant governor, a.k.a. the president of the Senate, on this idea of teacher pay raises. And so I think you do continue to see that emphasis in their proposed budget, which offers up $3.7 billion for these teacher pay raises. And that would be enough for school districts to pay every full-time teacher an additional $5,000 per year. This is something that Dan Patrick campaigned on in his reelection bid last year, and that he, I think, has been putting a little more emphasis on than the House has. But I think it is notable that after both these kind of dueling budgets came out earlier this week, the new House Speaker, Dennis Bonnen, I think he briefly spoke with reporters outside the chamber one day and continued to press this message, basically downplaying any, potential divisions here or rifts. He said, the numbers may be a little different at the top of the document, but we're all swimming in the right direction. We all agree that we need to put more money into public schools in Texas. And so even though the numbers showed a bit of a different story, you still saw this very emphatic message from state leaders this week that they're effectively on the same page.
Yeah. Any news on when we're going to start seeing committee assignments start to roll out?
I expect the Texas Senate committees to come out pretty soon. I wouldn't be shocked if they came out even today. That's just based on some of my reporting and what hearing around Austin. And I also expect the Texas House committees to maybe come out not shortly after that. Certainly expect them to come out sooner than they did last year under the previous speaker, Joe Strauss. And so that's kind of the next big story here in Austin, is to see who's going to be in charge of all these key committees. In the Senate, we already know that Charles Schwartner is not going to be returning as the chairman of the Health and Human Services Committee, which he basically forfeited amid this sexting scandal that's developed over the past few months here in Austin. And so that's a committee that already has kind of a vacancy at the top, and we're waiting to see who's going to fill that. You're going to have in the Senate, for example, you're going to have a new property tax committee this session. And so I've got some ideas about who could chair that, but we'll learn, obviously, who's going to be in charge of that panel when we get those committee assignments as well.
Visiting with Patrick Svitek of the Texas Tribune. You're also, I know, following very closely the presidential the presidential campaigns of at least one Democrat here in Texas, maybe of another one he's trying to find himself right now. So he wants you to stay far away. He wants to be away from all the reporters, Beto O'Rourke, as he finds himself.
Okay.
Julian Castro, he's found himself. He's running, and he went to Puerto Rico for his first stop.
Yeah, he did. I mean, he had been, before his announcement Saturday that he was running officially, he had been visiting some early voting states. But for his first post-announcement trip, he went to Puerto Rico. And, there's a lot of, layers of political symbolism there. It's obviously a U.S. territory that's still recovering from Hurricane Maria, which hit it in 2017, and the Trump administration's response to which was pretty universally criticized. And so he went there with that contrast. Obviously, he sends a message about focusing on the Latino vote and the Latino community in his campaign. I thought it was a pretty smart move, a little unconventional. I think it showed pretty clearly about the kind of candidate and campaign he wants to run.
Is he doing a lot of events? Because obviously, nationally, he's not getting a lot of play nationally, and it's early, and you've got all these other Democrats who are announcing. It seems like every other day there's a new announcement for somebody. So is he doing a lot of traveling and just kind of being under the radar right now?
Yeah, so after the Puerto Rico trip, he went to New Hampshire, obviously a more kind of traditional state for presidential candidates to visit, and he did 2 days of events there. He's in New York City today doing some, national TV appearances, and then I think he's heading back home to San Antonio this weekend. So he's keeping a pretty busy schedule, but you're right. I mean, this is, he is starting out as a underdog, to put it generously even. And here in Texas, of course, so much more attention is being paid to Beto O'Rourke, who, as you mentioned, isn't even in Texas this week. He's driving across the country and blogging about it. And so there's no doubt that Castro is, I think, flying under the radar for now at the national level.
As a reporter, I'm sure you see all the headlines that are coming out. To me, it seems like the national media, they're taking their turns now, and kind of where the overall conversation about Beto O'Rourke nationally was, they admired him almost. People who were taking a look at him just in the Texas Senate race, it was almost Obama-like coverage, right? People were talking about how he's the next Barack Obama. The last few days, and I think it's because of the Finding Himself tour that he's doing, it's almost like the news media is going after him a little bit harsher. Are you seeing that play out in some of the headlines you're reading as well?
Well, yeah, I'll even take a step back further from that, if you don't mind. I think that since, his presidential buzz has mounted, the media coverage has taken a more critical turn. And I think that you've seen since his campaign against Ted Cruz, he's faced a lot more scrutiny from his left about positions that may have not been scrutinized during the Senate race because he was running against Ted Cruz, and people didn't, people weren't trying to find the most ideologically pure candidate per se. And so he's been facing a lot more scrutiny on his left. And I think the media coverage, just in the more mainstream media, has been more critical because he is thinking about a presidential campaign. And I think that the expectations for him to be a more substantive figure in fleshing out some of his positions have skyrocketed, a little exaggerated, but have increased. I mean, you saw this interview he did with the Washington Post, I think it was published earlier this week, where he was asked a litany of questions about the situation at the border, which he has really made kind of a hallmark of his political career, at least recently. And he didn't have a lot of very specific answers. And he, pretty candidly said, I don't know, in response to a number of answers, and simply kind of called for a debate surrounding certain issues. And so, I think the scrutiny is only going to increase. Yeah. And I think if it's something he really has to consider if he's going to run for president, if he's going to be able to deal with some of these more critical political and policy questions that he, quite frankly, I don't think faced during the Senate race.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see, Patrick, next week, what are you going to be taking a look at, and what should people kind of be focusing on going into next week down in the legislature?
Yeah, I expect another relatively quiet week, except for the committee assignments potentially being announced. Sometimes traditionally, I think those committee assignments get announced on a Friday or a day when the place is not in session. So if somebody feels a little miffed about being subbed on a committee, they can go home and stew for the weekend. So we'll see what the timing is on those. But I expect another quiet week, and that's kind of how things work. It's a lot of pomp and circumstance at the beginning of the session, and then for several weeks things kind of cool off.
Now, I want to get one, the facts on this, and two, a prediction here, and a real prediction, Patrick.
Okay.
In the ping pong tournament between Evan Smith and Jonathan Stickland, who do you think's going to win, and when does this take place?
I don't know if we revealed the exact date yet. It's taking place next week, I saw. I'll put my money on Evan. Obviously, I have to support.
Okay, yeah. He got.
Member of the
is he going to wear a tie?
I'm a little offended they didn't pick me. I fashion myself kind of a skilled player as well.
So see, it's not going to be a quiet week. You got a big ping pong match between Evan Smith and Stickland. You never know what's going to happen. Patrick, tell folks where they can get more information about things that are going on over the Texas Tribune.
Yeah, head on over to the texastribune.org. Follow it, twitter.com/Texas Tribune. We'll have all the news on the legislature and statewide politics over the next week before I talk to you again.
All right, very good. Patrick, as always, appreciate your time. We'll visit with you next week.
Thanks so much.
That's Patrick Svitek, Texas Tribune.